Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the annual panel discussion. And as Peter said, this panel has quite a pedigree. We had John Thorne moderating it for many years, and the first 19th century conference, when it was called the 19th Century Conference, the panel was moderated by Fred Ivor-Campbell, who was, as you all those who knew him know, was a wonderful man. The term gentleman and scholar truly applied to Fred. And one thing I remember from that panel is that he started it with a quote from Homer, which is probably the first and last time anyone has quoted Homer at this conference. And that I won't be changing that tradition today. Today, we're going to the world of make-believe, which seems appropriate since this whole session is pretty much imaginary. We're pretending we're in Cooperstown, we're pretending we're all together. So why not pretend that William Holbert didn't die in 1882? What if he had lived until the end of the century, December 31st, 1899, since we're the 19th Century Committee, we decided to kill him off then. How would baseball have evolved differently? And to discuss this topic, we have three learned gentlemen. The first panelist is Jack Bales, who was a rookie at the Fred, but as I've gotten to know Jack a little through this process, I think it was inevitable that he found his way to the 19th Century Committee.
Right.
He gets excited by the same arcane things that we get excited about and no one else in the world does. I think it was only a matter of time before he found us. Jack retired in 2020 after more than 40 years as the reference and humanities librarian at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And if I recall correctly, Jack, that at least part of that campus sits atop that row of stone walls where the Confederate defenders. Yeah. As you stand up there at the foot of the campus and look down on those walls and the hill and the water, you have to wonder what kind of general would order attack up there in the middle of winter, which is, I guess, the same thing that Abraham Lincoln won after that.
Right. They say the president's home, the University president's home, used to be the hospital, and Clara Barton was there. That's his home now.
It's a beautiful campus.
Yeah.
And anyway, Jack is on this panel primarily because he's the author of Before They Were the Cubs, the early years of Chicago's first professional baseball team, published by McFarland in 2019. And he's ventured into the 20th century for his next book called The Chicago Cubs Shot for Love, a showgirl's crime of passion in the 1932 World Series. That book, published by the History Press, is scheduled to come out this summer. Mm-hmm. Our next panelist, the Invisible Man, Bill Lamb, is no rookie when it comes to the Fred. He's been to almost every one, done a number of presentations, and a few years ago, he delivered the keynote address. Bill had a 33-year career as a prosecutor in New Jersey, where his efforts helped make the state the crime-free paradise that it is today. He then retired to Meredith, New Hampshire, and has been extremely active with SABR. He's editor of the Inside Game, the quarterly newsletter of SABR's Dead Ball Committee. And Bill used both his baseball knowledge and his legal expertise to write an excellent book on the legal aspects of the Black Sox scandal called Black Sox in the Courtroom, which was published in 2013. He's also written articles for McFarland's baseball publication and has written many, many biographies for SABR's Bio Project. Bill, who is always known, if you know Bill, you know he's known for his modesty and unassuming manner. He asked that the following be included in his introduction. We quote, "What he knows about William Holbert would not fill up the back of a postcard, but he agreed to join this panel because anything he says about what a dead man might have done had he lived 20 years longer, no matter how improbable or inane, cannot be proven wrong." We'll see about that. Now, I asked each panelist to provide me with some introductory material, but our third member, Richard Hershberger, did not. So I had to come up with my own introduction for Richard, which really wasn't that hard because Richard is well known to the 19th Century Committee, much in the same manner that street vagrants are well known to the police. He's done a number of presentations at this session. He is an indefatigable researcher. He's also the author of a book called Strike Four, issued by Roman and Littlefield in 2019, which is the story of the evolution of baseball's rules and how the game became what it eventually became. As I said, he's an indefatigable researcher. I think he's read every newspaper that came out in the second half of the 19th century. And I always enjoy his presentations because he has interesting conclusions. Some of them border on lunacy, but they're always interesting. So I'm glad he has been on this panel with us once more to give us his opinions because he always has opinions. We're looking forward to hear from him. So on to our discussion. William Holbert had an angioplasty in early 1882, gave up smoking, changed his diet, fit as a fiddle, and ready to go for the 1882 season. The biggest challenge he has to face right now is an upstart league called the American Association. Under Abraham Mills, the two leagues made peace before the 1883 season. What panelists do you think would have happened if Hulbert was still alive? Who'd like to take that question and lead off?
Can I start some things off? Because I got some primary source material I dug up that I think everybody would like to know, and you guys know so much more about this than I do. Maybe you can play off of it. But I wanted to comment that, you know, Hulbert, and I found this out from his papers at the Chicago History Museum, that he did not want Sunday games in the America. He did not want Sunday games, not so much for religious reasons, because he wanted to keep the working class out of the ballpark. And of course, the American Association wanted to have them in. And he always stressed the word, Richard and I were talking about this through email, that he always wanted baseball to remain respectable. And so only the respectable people could participate. And in 1979, he said, once let the price of admission be lowered and the respectability of the game is gone. But then at the same time, you had this spirited correspondence with Denny McKnight of the Alleghenies, and that, I think they got almost liked each other, even though they disagreed. And he said, one time he said, I tell you, McKnight, Mr. McKnight, that many of the ideas upon which your association is based, like beer and Sunday games and a varied tariff for admission to championship games, are each and all the rankest fallacies. Each and every departure that I name lowers the tone. You cannot afford that. You cannot afford to bid for the patronage of the degraded. If you are to be successful, you must earn recognition by the respectable. And then he even invited McKnight to even visit him sometime in Chicago. So
let me throw it out to everyone. Do you think with that attitude, he would have tried to drive the other league out of existence, or he would have just let them do their own thing and stick to his own, you know, courting the upper class?
And now you all may have a different opinion, but I got the impression that he was, just from reading his letters, that he was almost prepared just to wait him out, you know, like how Spaulding did with the Players League, that he was just thought that, you know, if I kind of shoo them or be nice to them, maybe they'll go away and they'll flounder. But and then he also carried on a correspondence with Walter Appleton of the Metropolitans, and it was quite cordial too. And he invited him to come and see him. You know, even though we disagree, I'd like to see you. And right before he died, he confided to Appleton that, you know, I'm not doing too well, but I'm going to try to work on the schedule for the next year. So, and again, I could really be off basis. It's just the rankest speculation on my part that I think he might have just been wanting to wait them out and see what would happen.
Well, Bill, if you want me to chime in,
Richard, Bill,
I'll take it.
Richard,
Can you hear me?
okay, Bill, and then
Yeah.
Bill, and then Richard.
Okay. My thought is that things would not have played out substantially different had Holbert lived than they did. I think the problem that confronted him was the fact that in 1882 he is running a league that has teams not in New York City, not in Brooklyn, not in Philadelphia, nor are they in 5 of the other largest cities in the United States. He only has teams in Buffalo and Chicago. And now he has a new league, a viable alternative that's going to fill that vacuum. I think he would have had to accommodate them. He has to reach an agreement with them as to who's going to take what. It isn't a question of what would he have done. It's a question to me of what could he have done. And I think that, as Jack points out, his contacting of Walter Appleton, who was the secretary of the Metropolitan Exhibition Company, which was the corporate alter ego of John B. Day, the founder of the New York Metropolitans, indicates that he wanted to reach some sort of an understanding to get his league into New York. And I expect that he would have made similar overtures had he lived to Al Reach or whoever was in charge of Philadelphia. Because if he doesn't, he has to understand that the American Association is going to. So I think that the way things played out are not much different than they would have played out had he lived.
Richard?
All right. Well, at the risk of making this a love fest, I completely agree. When the National League made its accommodations with the American Association, it was not because they had warm feelings. It was out of necessity. It was a business decision. And the reason why the National League was not in New York and Philadelphia was because it was coming out of a national depression. And this is a leitmotif of mine. I pound it constantly. If you were to look at the number of minor league teams in the 1930s and say, gosh, the numbers are down, I wonder why, everybody would look at you like you're an idiot, because of course it's because of the Great Depression. And the same thing was going on in the late 1870s. What changed in 1882 is that the economy was coming out of the Depression, and the American Association moved into some very good baseball markets. And there was no fight over players because there was a surplus of good enough players. So there really wasn't anything directly to fight over the way that they would with the Players League 8 years later. And the 1882 season for the American Association was extremely successful. It was successful beyond their wildest dreams. And my favorite example of this was that the owners of the Cincinnati club were so surprised at how successful it was doing that they got into legal battles over who owned the club, because it had never occurred to them beforehand that that might be an issue. It was a question of who would be on the hook if it lost money. So coming out of the 82 season, the National League wasn't in a financial position to fight, because a fight would be where they would start signing players already signed to the American Association, and the American Association do the same thing back, and we all know how that goes. Salaries shoot through the roof, and it's a financial fight. It's whose bank account will run out first. And from our perspective, the American Association is tainted with failure, so we assume that, of course, they would have lost that. But in 82, 83, that's not at all clear. So the accommodation, the tripartite agreement, was absolutely an act of necessity. Now, the one other thing I want to add to what Jack was saying about the correspondence from Holbert to Denny McKnight is we have a term nowadays when your opponent gives you helpful advice on what you need to do to succeed. When somebody who is not your friend is telling you this, and we call that concern trolling. And I think that that's exactly what Holbert was doing. He was saying, he not only did not want competition, but the American Association was experimenting with a different business model that very well could succeed. And it did. I mean, the reasons why the American Association failed was not because of not because they were selling beer, and not because they were playing on Sundays.
Let me ask another sort of related question. If the American Association not forced the issue, at what point do you think that the National League would have gotten into New York and Philadelphia? Richard.
Yeah.
I think that the issue with Philadelphia and New York was always Troy and Worcester.
Yeah.
And that the problem that the league had was that Troy and Worcester weren't breaking any rules. So, we always talk about how the Athletics were kicked out after the first year. Well, they broke an ironclad rule because when they didn't finish the season. But a rising tide lifts all boats. The improving economy was such that Troy and Worcester could get by even when they were getting 37 people at a game. So the question is, at what point would the league decide to oust Troy and Worcester, even though they hadn't broken any rules? And the conventional answer is that Holbert would never have done that, because Holbert was such a man of principle, which, yeah, sell me another one. So I think that they would have had to do it sooner rather than later. And getting back to what if Holbert had lived, I would reword the question as what if Holbert was in better health in autumn of 1881? Because Holbert made a strategic error. He should have ousted Troy and Worcester then. He should have done it a year earlier than he did. He should have moved into New York and Philadelphia, both of which would have been thrilled to get in. And if they had done that, then they would have never had the American Association would never have had a foothold. Mm-hmm. So that to me is the real what if.
Well, that's an interesting point. And I see that, this as a sort of a stepping off point, and we need to really restrict discussion if we find something interesting in another field. So we dealt with the American Association, and then 1884, you have peace. And I think, Bill Lamb, you're saying that there would have been peace in any event. Then comes 1884. You've got the Union Association. You have then trouble. I think 1882, 1883 was competition, but not danger. But 1884, clearly the leagues were starting, they were not doing nearly as well financially as they had been doing. What might have happened in 1884?
I think what happened in 1884 is exactly what would have happened had Holbert been in charge of the league. Unlike the situation confronting him in 1882, he's reached an accommodation with the American Association. They have divided the pie, so to speak. Now you have an interloper that is going to place teams. What's interesting is that in 1882, when the American Association was a six-club circuit, they didn't place any clubs in National League teams. Whereas in 1884, the Union Association is going to place teams in St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Baltimore, which are American Association teams. They're going to place teams in Boston and Chicago, which are National League teams. And they're going to place a team in Philadelphia, which is both an American Association and a National League team. So they're going to basically invade territories that the American Association and the National League have divided among themselves. Secondly, I think that the Union Association is a vanity project. And I don't think that it had the financial backing or the sites that would intimidate Holbert or Holbert's successors. He would have willingly gone into battle with them. I think that what happens in 1884 is something you're going to see throughout the course of baseball history. When we have two major leagues, they learn to agree with each other. The American Association and the National League reached an agreement. 20 years later, the American League and the National League reached an agreement. But they'll never accommodate a third league. It doesn't happen in 1884. It won't happen in 1890. It won't happen in 1914 with the Federal League, or even in 1946 with the Mexican League, or in 1960 with the Continental League. Baseball, the powers that be, the people in charge, just do not feel or will not tolerate a third league. So I think that the hostile measures that they took against the Union Association would not have been any different had Holbert been around to lead the charge rather than Mills.
Just you said, Bill, I was just writing about 1884, and one of the phrases I used was that in the history of baseball, two's company and three's a crowd has been pretty much a staple. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Richard, Jack?
Don't know.
Yeah. Now, one question that you had Mills in those situations. I don't know if you want to touch on the relationship between Holbert and Mills, how much influence Holbert had over Mills. So therefore, his sort of spirit was infused in the National League at that point in its strategy.
I would pass on that. I don't really know much about the personalities involved. I think I probably know more about Joanne than I do about William Hulbert.
What would Joanne have done if she was fighting the Union Association? Jack?
Yeah, I don't know that much about their relationship either. I know that Albert Spaulding, he refused to rock any boats, And someone asked a question about the anti-Irish feelings at that time, and I got the impression again from reading the correspondence and from reading some of Spaulding's writings, was that they're all these businessmen and they didn't want to rock any boats among the respectable people in town. And Tom Foley, the business person of the Chicago White Stockings, he was Irish and he did a great job for the White Stockings. And I read in a secondary source, I've not seen any primary source material on this, but he was kicked out of the club because he was Irish. And I had not known that before. And so I think, they wanted to maintain baseball for the respectability. And when Spaulding came on board, after Hulbert died, he wasn't going to rock any boats too, and he wanted to stay out of Sunday baseball and no alcohol and everything else. He just wanted to follow the party line that Hulbert maintained as well. So now I don't know if Mills had the same thing or not, but
we're getting back to the Union Association. Would Holbert have let Lucas into the league, do you think?
I don't know what would have happened. The fact of the matter is that Lucas did get into the league, which is something that, again, is going to recur. The established leagues, once they've defeated the enemy, seem willing to take in the best or the most well-heeled of their adversaries. Because in 1890, several of the Players League owners will be invited in, particularly in New York City. And in 1914, Charlie Wiegman and Phil Ball will get organized baseball franchises. So I think it's let's defeat the league, and then among the prisoners, we'll see if there's anybody who can be of use to us. So I don't know, leaving personalities aside, and I don't know enough about Holbert to take a position on whether he'd be vindictive or not. But I think that the fact that Lucas was admitted into the league suggests that there's a precedent here that's going to be followed in future as well.
Yeah, and it's almost not just in baseball and sports, but you buy out the other side. Somebody's really opposing you, buy them out and put them on your side.
Yeah.
Now what we're seeing here with Lucas and the later examples that Bill cited, this is how you break a competing league. I put it a little more cynically, is that you cut out from the herd. Now, usually when we say cut out from the herd, you're cutting out the weak. Often in this case, you're cutting out the strong. So the price that the National League paid to get rid of the Union Association, which was they were preparing for an 1885 season. The Union Association did not collapse at the end of the 84 season. So the price that the National League paid was to give Henry Lucas what he had wanted all along. And Spaulding was strongly in favor of that, because Spaulding also regarded, naturally, Chicago and St. Louis are natural regional rivals. So Spaulding wanted a team in St. Louis. I don't think he really cared one way or the other about Henry Lucas. That's just business. The National League ran roughshod over the American Association because the tripartite agreement included territorial rights. So von der Ahe had to waive that restriction. And the way that the National League did that was they made it clear that they would go to war over this, and they looked at the other 7 owners of American Association clubs and said, are you going to go to war to defend von der Ahe? And the answer was no, they weren't.
Richard, I want to ask you, what you say they were preparing for the 1885 season. Do you think that was legitimate, or it was just to give Lucas another card to play and get him? Because you look at them, the whole eastern wing of the Union Association was pretty much done. They were just talking about being in the West. You had Ted Sullivan and him, and that was almost it. Would you think there really could have been a viable UA in 85, or they were just trying to make it look like it?
I think it would have been a regional, because you were right about the Eastern clubs, that those had already cut out. So what they were looking at was sort of a super Western league. And certainly the other clubs thought that they were, because when Henry Lucas sold them up the river, they were pissed. I mean, their reactions, this was not just play acting. And it was absolutely Lucas selling them up the river, because they thought that they were going to have an 1885 season. Lucas, by the way, was a terrible businessman. That's another key to understanding what's going on with him, is he was old money. And and he ended up blowing his old money, most of which was in real estate. He owned a big chunk of what's now downtown St. Louis. And losing money on real estate in a growing economy, you really have to work hard to do that.
I understand. Did he wind up as like a building inspector for the city of St. Louis or some fairly low level job? Is that correct?
He was a clerk in one of the city offices. What?
Yeah.
Well, he was with the railroad for a while. I mean, when you're old money and you lose your money, there are people who will give you a job. But so, he was never starving in the streets. But yes, it was much reduced circumstances.
Well, you never have to worry about getting information here. Just say something. We got a message here. By 1889, he was a railroad clerk. So, thank you.
You mentioned Holbert, if he was vindictive. I think he was vindictive, but I think he would probably be vindictive to be on the sneaky side from what he did with the White Stockings and everything. I think it was underhanded vindictive, and I think he would do anything to get what he wanted, and he did do anything to get what he wanted. But I think he was a little underhanded more than just out in the open.
Now,
I think he was ruthless. I'm not sure he was vindictive.
Okay.
There's this story that you see over and over again, that the reason the National League wasn't in New York and Philadelphia is because Holbert was mad at the Mutuals and the Athletics, which makes no sense at all. And there's no primary evidence for that. I think that's a modern somebody trying to understand why, and it's a complicated reason, discussion on why they were not in New York and Philly, but it wasn't because Holbert was personally unhappy with the city of New York.
Yeah.
Now, Jack, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Holbert and Spaulding, because a lot of the later, after Spaulding or after Holbert died, Spaulding did a lot of the things that Holbert might have been doing. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between them and what their similarities or differences?
Yeah. Spaulding came on board, of course, following Holbert's death, and off the top of my head, I don't know, and I wrote about this in my book, but off the top of my head, I can't think of it too much. But he really, I say worshiping is too strong of a word, but he did everything that Holbert wanted him to do. I do know that, and he followed him pretty well. But he also had his business too, and he might have tread a fine line here. He wanted to do what he could for Holbert and to follow and promote the White Stockings and everything. But he also had his own business. He wanted to promote Spaulding's baseballs and Spaulding's uniforms and everything like that. Both Holbert and Spaulding, I have seen this in primary sources and secondary sources. As I said before, they were businessmen, and they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or whatever. They weren't about to to deviate from the norm, shall we speak. And when Spaulding took over, he did not want to deviate anything from what Hulbert said. In fact, one time a reporter asked him about Sunday baseball, and he said, I have no doubt that we could fill every seat in our grounds were we to play scheduled games, but I do not believe that the club would be better off financially. And he said we would not still stand so high among the better class of citizens. Again, that whole thing about respectability, he would not endorse. He took a low key approach when he was involved with the National League and with the White Stockings. And Sunday baseball, of course, moved at a very sluggish pace when Spaulding was on board with Chicago. But yeah, they did get along pretty well, from what I gather, and they worked well together too.
Now, if Sunday baseball, the prohibition of Sunday baseball, a lot of people thought it was Holbert's thing, but it persisted for a long time after he passed away. Why was that?
Well, because Spaulding was on board, and Spaulding had his hand from what I got, and something like Richard and Bill, you guys would know more, maybe know more about this, but I got the impression Spaulding had a good hand in the National League too, and maybe they weren't going to rock any boats, but when James Hart purchased the Colts in 1892, he took a completely different approach. I mean, he could see that the World's Fair was coming, and he saw money, and he said point blank, we are going to have Sunday baseball. That's why he built the West Side grounds. And in fact, a reporter asked him if they were going to play Sunday games, and he said, well, it looks that way. The old stockholders objected to Sunday games, but they're retired. They'll no longer go here, and there seems no reason why we should not play on Sunday. And I shall urge the new board to adopt a more liberal policy, and I have every reason to believe that we'll be open on Sundays. And he said that in 1892. And he said that there are thousands of poor people who want to view the game, and we got to get them into the ballpark. I'm sorry, Richard.
I just wanted to ask you, did you check? I don't know the answer to this. Did the Chicago play home games on Sunday in 1892?
Their first game was on May 14th, 1893 at the Brand, because their lease at the Southside grounds would not permit them to play Sunday games. And so they had an alternate schedule. They had two different parks, and they played Sunday games at the West Side grounds and other games at another ballpark. And I could be wrong about that, but I do know they had two ballparks because of the leases on the one. I think it was the Southside Park. They could not play Sunday games. Yeah,
they had something just to that. In many states, you simply could not play professional baseball on Sunday because Sunday blue laws prohibited it. And that is why teams in Boston and Philadelphia and New York sometimes went out of their way to transplant their games to other venues to get around the Sunday blue laws. Philadelphia played in Gloucester City, New Jersey. Brooklyn transferred games to Queens, where the blue laws were not enforced very rigorously until 1889, when the proprietors of Ridgewood Park were indicted. And that brought that aspect to an end. But there were still games. I think we had a presentation yesterday about a game played in Weehawken, New Jersey, which is right across the river. And there were obviously benefits to be derived from playing on Sunday. It was just a matter of whether you could get around the law in those places where it was illegal.
And you look at the crowds for Sunday games, they were just so much larger than any other, the weekday games, certainly, because you couldn't play at night.
The games that Brooklyn played in 1887 and 1888 rather, the crowds were substantially larger at Ridgewood Park than they were at Brooklyn's home grounds during the week.
And on the topic of Holbert and Sunday games, after the 1879 season, the Chicago club went to California, which was mostly San Francisco at that point. Yeah. And those were Sunday games. That was the market in California, and the Chicago team, and they advertised themselves as the Chicago club, and Holbert never said no. Those were just 9 guys going off on their own. They played Sunday games routinely.
I did not know that. Yeah.
Without a murmur in the Chicago press. Oh, yeah. They just let it slide.
In 1891, I think it was, during the off season, I think the National League passed a law or rule or whatever that said that they could schedule games on Sundays back to the city laws, if the city laws said it was okay. But again, and that's when Spaulding softened his stance a bit, but he still didn't really, go through with it.
That was a result of the merger of the National League and the American Association, which people, we tend to kind of think that the American Association was on its last gasp, but that's less true than usually imagined. They were actually in a fairly strong negotiating position, and that was one of the terms that they insisted on. was that they could continue to play Sunday games.
Well, you said earlier, Richard, that they went out of business, but you look at the teams that have survived. I mean, that went on to the 20th century. Yeah, I mean, they were.
All of the modern teams were American associations originally.
Of course,
Yeah, go ahead.
When the Columbian Exposition opened, they had the whole thing about the Sunday Blue laws then, and there was a big thing in the newspapers about things, the park being open and playing games on Sundays, and ministers threatened to boycott them and everything else. But again, the Chicago played its first game on May 14th, 1893, and it all took off after that. And gradually, New York and Brooklyn played on May 21st, 1893.
Well, one of the biggest issues in the final 2 decades of the 19th century was labor relations, including the impact of the Reserve Clause, which came in under Holbert's reign, and then, of course, the later formation of the Brotherhood. Would Holbert have handled these issues differently? Leading up to, I don't know about the Players League as it came off, but would it have gotten to that point, or would he have taken a different tack, do you think?
My guess is that if you see what Spaulding did, you see what his mentor, Holbert, would have done. I don't think that there's much evidence to suggest that Holbert would have been conciliatory toward the Players Association.
You think he would have been tougher and it would have gone down sooner?
I think he would have been the same. He could not have been much more hard-nosed than Spaulding was. Spaulding went out of his way to confront the Players League. He is the one who scheduled games for the New York and Philadelphia teams that'd be head-to-head rather than give open dates to their games. He wanted the confrontation. He was going to put this league down. And even when it resulted almost in catastrophe for a couple of the franchises, he was a bitter ender. So I think that it is probable that his inner Hulbert was coming through.
Well, we got a question from the audience here, which I'd like to throw in now. It said, basically, what would have happened to Spaulding had Holbert lived? Well, how would his role have been different? I think that's the question. If that's not correct, if not, it's not true, correct me. But what would have happened to Spaulding different? How would Spaulding's life have been different?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm
I
not
hadn't
sure.
thought about that.
I've not thought about it either. But Spaulding retired anyway. I think it was in '91. But he had his sporting goods store to run, and again, this is just conjecture on my part, but maybe they just would have gone on business as usual. He was doing well. He and his brother and even his mother was involved with their sporting goods store. So it might have just been business as usual. I don't know.
Business as usual being that he did not get involved in the White Stockings. He just ran a sporting goods business.
Well, he would have maybe still been of Hulbert's right-hand man, I think, but he probably would have just done what Hulbert was doing.
Yeah.
Again,
but Jack is absolutely right that Spaulding was making his money through his sporting goods business, yeah. And I'm sure he was making money through the Chicago club as well. But how long he would have been willing to be the right-hand man, who knows? He had his own gig. He could have gone to any time.
Yeah, I remember reading in a couple of newspaper articles. We're talking about the Players League that the Brotherhood, they still respected Spaulding, but it was Cap Anson though they really hated. But then I guess everybody hated Cap Anson. But I still think they had a certain amount of respect for Spaulding anyway. He made a bit hard-nosed, but he was direct and I remember an opposing player started talking to Cap Anson one time, and he just walked away he was so angry, and he just walked away from him once, and because of some comment that he made. And another player who was on the Brotherhood the year before, then later came to Chicago, and he was having breakfast with Cap Anson, who made some derogatory comment about the Brotherhood. He just left his breakfast untouched and walked away.
We've got a couple comments here coming in. One question is, would there have been a world tour if Spaulding hadn't been allowed to blossom after Holbert's death?
That's a great question too. Yeah.
The world tour served a double function for Spaulding. Right? it was certainly largely promoting his sporting goods.
Yes. Uh-huh.
I mean, that was the real point, but
Right.
the tool, the Chicago club was the tool that he had at hand to do that. So could he have arranged it if he did not have the Chicago club at his beck and call? I don't know.
Yeah.
Would have been more complicated.
I remember reading it was not a successful venture. I mean, he lost money on that. I mean, they had a good time and everything, but it was not successful financially. But yeah, as Richard said, it was primarily to promote his sporting goods store too and promote his business.
I understand Anson invested some money in that, didn't he? And
Yeah,
lost it.
he lost some money too. He and Spaulding, Anson and Spaulding parted ways later on. They were really bitter enemies from the way, I think from an investment point of view, money that he had tied up in the team.
Of course, and Jack, you probably knows certainly better than I, the profitability of the Chicago team under Holbert, under Spaulding. How did that talk a little bit about that? How it grew? Because certainly in the early years they were the only profitable one, but not nearly as profitable as later.
Yeah, but they in fact I did come across quite a bit of that when I was working on my research, and even then in later years, I think they still made some money even back in the later part of the 19th century. And in fact, I even had a whole section in the index of my book on profits, and I just find articles in the newspapers saying, well, the Chicago team and other teams, they made a profit. They did pretty well. So no, there was one year when, let's see, James Hart came on board in 91, and I think it was a year or so after that when he was just about ready to throw in the towel because they just lost their shirts. That it might have been the year of the Players League, or maybe the year after that. So they did not do really well. And he made a comment that I could just give me a nickel for every dollar that I've invested so far in this thing, and I'd come off okay. But they did not do well. But later picked up, of course. I think with the playing on Sunday and the West Side grounds really helped them out later on.
We got a comment in response to the question earlier. What about Spaulding if Hulbert had still lived, and said he would have continued as team secretary in his opinion because he valued the connections in order to sell his sporting goods equipment.
Yeah. That's
certainly
right.
A defensible position. I won't say
Yes,
it's
exactly
wrong.
right. Yeah.
Now, were there anything externally that happened in baseball that would have made Holbert a different person, or caused him to take a different course had he lived later on? Would he have been a different person in 1888 because of things that happened outside of external factors in baseball?
Well, comment on I'm not sure if this is an external factor, but I've always been intrigued by this. When in 1886, when Chicago lost to St. Louis in the championship, Spaulding got mad and wouldn't even pay the White Stockings train fare back to Chicago, and he gutted the team. He got rid of Mike Kelly, he got rid of Jim McCormick and Abner Dalrymple and George Gore, and I've always wondered, would Holbert have done something like that? I mean, the team lost the year after that, and of course, Holbert was committed to win, and so it's not exactly an external factor, but I think Spaulding blew it that year. I wonder what he was thinking.
We might also wonder. I mean, Holbert did not come from baseball. Like Spaulding came up through baseball, Reach came up through baseball. A lot of these guys in that generation were baseball men from the start, but Holbert wasn't. I mean, he was a coal merchant. So another possibility is that he would have decided it wasn't worth the hassle. I mean, we talked earlier about A.G. Mills. He was only president of the league for a couple of years because that he had a real business to run with Otis Elevator, and I think it's entirely conceivable that Holbert would have decided I got to concentrate on my business.
And one thing, Mills did not have a proprietary interest in the National League. My opinion was that Holbert was so invested in the National League that it had become the most important thing. It was like his league. He'd started it. He was a primary factor. And it's like a person who starts a business. It's different than if you are an investor in the business. You know,
Well,
I think he was more committed.
That raises another question. If he had lived for another 20 years, that Holbert as president of the league was, this imperial presidency that very few league, you look through history, very few league presidents have been that way. Dan Johnson is the other obvious example. The reason Holbert was able to do that was because Chicago was the only club making any money. So everybody else needed Chicago more than he needed everybody else, so he could call the shots. 10 years later, in the late 1880s, would New York and Boston and Philadelphia have put up with that? It might have led to a very different later history. The reason why the National League beat the American Association, I believe, ultimately, is that the National League owners were much more unified, whereas the American Association always had factionalism, and that's what brought it down when they had those dozens of votes for league president that were deadlocked because you had two factions equally sized. So Brooklyn and Cincinnati just up and left and jumped to the National League. And that's ultimately what brought the American Association down. And you never had any of that in the National League. At least the clubs that mattered, basically Chicago, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And John T. Brush, once he's in the picture, they always presented a united front. But would they have if Holbert was trying to be the imperial presidency? I don't know.
That's an interesting point. We're getting down toward the end.
Yeah.
Any final comments? Any from any of the panelists?
Yeah.
I just want to say, for those of you who haven't attended the Fred before and you can't see me, just think Paul Newman.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to thank my panelists. You guys did a great job and helped me along too, because I'm a new guy to all this stuff. And I really appreciate all your help.
Well, I thank all three panelists, Richard, Jack, Bill. Thank you very much for being part of this. And thank you also to those of you who sent your questions in and sent your answers in. So I think that's no more comments. Peter, we'll pass it back to you.
Well, I just want to say I wrote a note to myself to pick up Jack's book from McFarland before they were the Cubs, because I now want a copy.
Okay. Yeah, right. Good. Good.
Bill, thank you very much. That is a very lively discussion. There was a couple of direct questions that I came in. I thought I would just throw them out right before you guys disband. One, Jerry Casway asked something very interesting. I don't know if he has a lead into this, but Jerry says, did William Holbert have a drinking problem in the early 1880s? Does
Boy,
anybody know of that?
I never saw anything about it in the White Stocking papers and the Chicago History Museum. I mean, no, I did not see any allusion to it. And in the secondary stuff, the newspaper articles that I read, I never saw anything of it. He could have, but I never saw anything about it myself.
I have seen one reference when the discussion with players drinking. Some writer commented that Holbert was one to talk because he's been known to enjoy
Oh, really?
whiskey.
Yeah.
Now, I did not take that to be that he necessarily was enjoying it to excess. I think it could certainly be taken as, he had a nightcap like many of us do. But I don't know. I've never heard that he was an alcoholic.
Yeah, he sure took the players to task, though. I mean, he would. Paul Hines, I remember, really got in at one time with him about it.
I think alcoholism is a relative term in that part. There are a lot of people who were pretty heavy drinkers. It was just a way of life for a lot of people. You were a teetotaler or drinker.
Okay, so now I got an answer from one of our audience members here, and he's not. He's fairly significant. Michael Hobart, who chairs the Business of Baseball Committee and is also as we'll be doing a 19th century speaker series based on one of his previous talks about Holbert at the Fred. So next year, Mike will be talking about Holbert. He says there is reference to drinking problem when he was younger. He went to the East Coast to dry out. That reference is some of his family correspondence.
Really?
So
Wow.
apparently there is a little bit there.
Way to go,
Peter
Michael.
Morris asked, would have had to choose between being president of the National League and president of the White Stockings had he lived longer? If so, which would you have chosen? So
Well,
he's asking if Hulbert had the choice of being the president of the National League or just president of the White Stockings, which would you have chosen?
well, there's that quote about how I'd rather be a lamppost in Chicago than a, whatever, someplace else. So I don't know.
His famous expression.
Yeah, I don't think he would have had to choose because he ran the league. Someone
ran the league, yeah.
had to insist that he step down, and I don't think anyone would have done that.
Yeah, John Thorne in that article on the National League in the preceding issue of Baseball, he mentioned that at the final end that Buckley was the titular president in name only because Holbert ran the league.
Okay.
And I think that,
Yeah.
Bill, by the chats we received that this is a lively topic with a little, with some people who have chimed in. But I have to. We're gonna go to a break right now. So it's about a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back to our last two presenters. Bill, I want to thank you for moderating this discussion. It was not an easy discussion. It was a very lively topic in a sense, and it had to do a lot of conjecture, which is not always easy. But you guys did a great job. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all panelists. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everybody, very much.
Thank you, Jeff.